welcome to the Semex podcast. My name is Clarissa McCallum, Marketing Coordinator. I'm joined, as always, by Brenda Lee, our Communications Specialist. Hi, Brenda.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Excellent.
Well, today we're joined by Dr. Michael Lohuis, our Vice President of Research and Innovation here at Semex, to talk about the past 2 years or even more of research with our Methane Efficiency Index and where we're at today.
Yeah, I mean, it's been 2 years, and he's certainly traveled a lot of miles and been a lot of places and has some interesting insights into where the methane index is today versus where it was. And just, it's very interesting for me to hear which markets are most interested in this index and where they're putting it to work and the additional research that is happening with it. And then also, the platforms that this has given him to really educate consumers, the public, and our own clients.
Absolutely. Let's get right into it.
Yeah, let's dig in. Well, Mike, Dr. Lohuis, it's great to have you. And everybody at Semex is really proud of the methane index. And it's been a few years since we've had you on. I think it was 2023 when we first launched. And since then, it's received a lot of awards globally. So that's very impressive and certainly is very encouraging. What's that journey been like? You've been kind of leading the charge with methane at Cemex. How's that been going?
Well, it's been pretty fun, and thanks, Brenda and Clarissa, for the chance to talk about methane again. It's been quite a ride for the whole team, and it's different from some of the other traits because the people that we are talking to are very different than our typical traits. When we bring out a trait, it's usually we're talking mostly with farmers, customers, our producers. And this time it's very different. We're talking to the whole breadth of the supply chain. So it's been a different kind of experience for us.
And a little bit about the awards. Where were those located and what were they for?
Well, the first award was maybe the most consequential, was the International Dairy Federation Award, which was I believe it was the same year that we launched it. It was in end of 2023, and that was important because it's an international audience, and the IDF, the International Dairy Federation, provides guidance to processors, retailers, producers around the world on what are the best practices. And for them to provide an award to Cemex and Lactanet on the introduction of a new genetic tool to reduce methane was remarkable. There's been some other awards, some at the University of Guelph, some overseas, the UK, the Netherlands, Denmark. It's really nice to get international recognition because really this is a global trait and it has global interest. One thing I should mention is this has been a real team effort, and not just Drew Sloan and Francesca Malchiotti and I, but it's also been a really good partnership with Lactanet, and there's been several scientists at Lactanet that have been with us on this journey. They're the ones that publish the evaluations, and the University of Guelph is where it all started. I mean, they made the breakthrough that correlated MIR, mid-infrared spectroscopy, with being able to predict actual methane. So that was a huge breakthrough. And so none of this would have happened if we didn't have that good.
Well, I think Brenda and I are a little bit most interested. You've kind of given us a bit of a snippet that there's some new research coming out since the last time we talked to you on this podcast. Can you give us a little bit of information on that new research?
Yeah, so the new research is focused on proving to the industry that this genetic tool actually works. And to do that, you need to validate with a different set of animals from what you started with in your research trial. So we had a couple of, maybe three different validations that we did over the last year. One was starting with cows across Canada, 25,000 cows that we had milk samples for. And what we did was try to correlate or predict the actual methane or the mirror predicted methane that came from those milk samples with the genomic ranking for methane efficiency. And we got what we were expecting, which was a nice straight line. So everywhere from 90 relative breeding value to 110 relative breeding value. That's 20 points, 4 standard deviations. And the line we saw was a straight line, except on the ends where you don't have as many animals represented. But it was nice to see that straight regression line that shows you that you can predict methane from the breeding value in a fairly predictive way. So that was the first validation, maybe something that we needed to do. And then the second and third validations were on measuring the methane from a green feed machine. And a green feed machine, just to remind you guys, is
Mhm.
where an animal sticks its head into a trough for a period of minutes, and the machine sucks the air out of the trough and measures the amount of methane the cow is emitting. And it's not just the concentration, but it's also the amount of methane. So that's where it has an advantage over, let's say, sniffers, where it's just measuring the concentration. So we were able to show that animals that were not yet milking in the research herds, when we predicted them with the breeding value, so the breeding value is from a genetic test, a genotype. When we looked at their actual methane results, we got what we were expecting to see. So the high methane efficiency animals were producing the least amount of methane, and the low methane efficiency animals were producing the most methane, and that's exactly what we were expecting to see. And there was a statistically significant difference between those two groups. And the third validation was to say, okay, if it works in Canada, what about if we take this to other countries? And so we had data from a couple of collaborating countries in the European Union, and so we shared data with them, and they shared data with us. What we shared was genotypes and the phenotype, and the phenotype in this case was green feed methane measured. And in that case, again, we saw what we were expecting to see, that the low methane efficiency animals produced the most methane, and the high methane efficiency were the lowest emitting group. So that confirmed that not only does it work in Canada, but it works overseas as well. Now, the proviso there is that these have to be Holstein populations, because that's the evaluation is based on Holsteins.
Right.
And just as a reminder to anybody who didn't tune in the first time or maybe hasn't done a lot of research into this, it's from the nose, the mouth that we're measuring this, not from the back end of the cow. I know that seems a little remedial, but there's a lot of, misinformation about that out there.
Yeah, we just keep reminding people burps, not farts.
Burps,
Yeah.
exactly.
I think most of the press is getting it right now. Most of them are
Yeah.
talking about burps.
Good.
And you said that there was some research activity in Europe and different places. Where are you seeing what countries or regions of the world are really grabbing a hold of the index and wanting to start implementing this sort of breeding strategy?
Yeah, it started with the UK, actually. That's where we introduced it at the Semex conference, and it got a lot of attention early on in the UK. And so we had a lot of folks like Muller, Arla. These were milk processors that already were working on sustainability practices. And so they got very interested that, hey, there's a genetic tool that we can use as well. And so we've spent a lot of time with them. In following that, we reached out, or we spoke with groups in Australia, which was interesting that they really picked up on this as well. And I guess it's because, when you talk about larger cattle populations and smaller human populations, then a greater proportion of emissions from the economy come from agriculture. The same would apply to New Zealand, Ireland, right? So that's why those countries are particularly aware of their emissions from agriculture. So they're looking for ways that they can reduce it. We've had other interests from Germany, Mexico, Netherlands, even recently in the U.S. from environmental groups. They've been looking for ways to reduce methane, and the message we get from the environmental groups is, look, methane is a potent greenhouse gas. It's short-lived, but it has an outsized effect in the near term. So if we can do something about methane in the next 10 years, it buys us a little time to reduce CO2 in the rest of the economy. So that's why some of the environmental groups have caught on to methane and looked at that as an early tool for adoption. So those are some of the countries. Some of the companies that came to mind, Agripoor here in Canada, Arla, as I mentioned, in Europe and the UK, Coles in Australia, Friesland Campina in the Netherlands, Lactalis, which is one of the biggest processors in the world, Nestle, Sigma Foods, even Starbucks. We've talked to about, surprisingly, Starbucks enteric methane, or in other words, methane from ruminants was the majority of their greenhouse gases in their supply chain. So they were very keen to look at ways to reduce methane.
So it's really just quite global. Everywhere is kind of looking at this and seeing what they can do with it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Mike, you've sat in on some really interesting panels in the last 2 years in different conferences and such. What kind of questions are people asking you at those?
Well, each panel is different. Well, there's two panels that I did this year. One was in Texas, Dallas, and this was part of the Animal Ag Tech meetings. That's a very much more industry focused group. And in Dallas, they were interested in, what's the return on investment for
Hmm.
reducing methane? And will consumers pay for this? Was one of the questions that came up. They asked, how much does it cost? Can we measure this? How can we measure it easily, accurately, without too much cost? And so there's a lot of discussion around the nuts and bolts, the cost, payback. Um, Interestingly, a lot of the people in the room didn't feel that being consumers and consumer behavior, when you quiz them about it in a survey, they will say, yes, I will pay more for this. But when then you look at what happens in the grocery store, they don't. They go for whatever has the lowest price. So that's kind of one of the messages. But the other message was that the retailers who have their brand on it, they want to reduce methane and they want to gain customers by having that kind of a profile, a positive environmental profile. So even though consumers don't pay for it directly or actually want to do that, they do select brands that reflect their values. And
Hmm.
so that was the message: is consumers will pay for it, but not necessarily directly, but indirectly through the way they choose their brands,
Hmm.
which I found pretty interesting.
Hmm.
Yeah, no, that is very interesting for sure. And then food is so personal that you can see why that's the case, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And the other panel was very different. It was part of San Francisco Climate Week, based in San Francisco. And this was a much broader, more global audience. These were representing a wide range of philanthropists, donors that want to make a difference on climate change. And so they really keyed in on the fact that they wanted to know, does this technology work and how long will it take for this to work? Because they're used to seeing a lot of ideas that are very futuristic and they are often disappointed because they realize it's not really ready yet. So there's a lot of interest in this solution because it actually is already ready and it's already working. And so that was a lot of questions were kind of like, really, is it already available? And how much does it cost? And will farmers buy it? And what's the cost of farmers? And some people wanted to know, could this translate to developing countries, or the developing world?
Mhm.
And how would you do this if you wanted to take it to Africa or India? And so we had some good discussion about what would be required to do that. But yeah, depending on the panel, you get very different questions.
And then the answer to that is about the cost to a farmer is.
Yeah, I mean, I was able to tell them that there's virtually no cost to the farmer because we're not charging a premium for this.
Hmm.
Uh, and because the trait is uncorrelated with the regular economic traits, milk, fat, protein,
Mhm.
um, that there's really no cost to them in terms of selection. Now, let's say if you're a farmer and you want to have only the very best methane bulls, you would give up a little bit on some of the other traits. Not today because there's not a great demand yet. In the future, though, if everybody's competing for the top methane bulls, then you might have to go down the list a bit. But yeah, they were impressed that it was so easy to implement. Farmers just needed to select different bulls, that those bulls were already available. The other thing that they really liked was the fact that it's easy to implement. There's no special training required.
Hmm.
It's a permanent solution. So once you make a genetic change, it's permanent unless you select
Mhm.
backwards
Hmm.
against it. And it's cumulative. One generation's success will translate, and the next generation builds on the previous generation's genetic gain. So yeah, it checked a lot of boxes for people that are looking for solutions that work today, and there's not many barriers.
And for those that are a little bit newer to the methane reduction, what impact is this looking like it's going to have as far as by 20 whatever it should do this?
Well, yes, we can break down the future into different increments, I guess.
Hmm.
And today, what we're seeing is a lot of supply chains are already including sustainability practices in their reward or incentive package to farmers. Arla, for example, has incentives for carrying out sustainable practices. Friesland Campina does the same. Sigma Foods is the first one that is willing to subsidize semen that is lower methane. So that's interesting. And I think probably in another 2 years, we're going to see more partners in the supply chain that are ready to accept a genetic solution and provide incentives for that. So that, one of the things we're working on right now in terms of the research is it's not sexy, but what we have to do is publish the validations that we've done. We have to publish the underlying methods for quantifying it. So, it's very clear to us. We can see the pattern across a population, but we have to convince people that are non geneticists that this is a tool that should be part of every methane reduction toolbox. It's kind of like it's going to become like table stakes for the industry because it's so easy. It's a good baseline technology. In the long term, let's say after 5 years, towards 10 years, what we're expecting is that uh, the milk processors that have figured out how to build this into their supply chain, incentivize the producers in their supply shed, they're going to have a better profile on their milk than processors that are not paying attention. And the retailers have all made commitments on reducing their profiles, their greenhouse gas footprints. And so the consumers, the shareholders are looking closely at to see how well have they done relative to the promises they made. And if they can show that their supply chain has a lower footprint, they're going to be in a better position. They're going to be able to answer those tough questions from their shareholders. And the retailers will want to source their product from the processors that have the lowest footprint. That's going to take some time, right? It's the industry doesn't switch on a dime, but over 5 to 10 years, absolutely, we're going to see um, advantages to processors that are able to provide a lower footprint product to the retail segment.
It's so interesting. So do you think that the holdup is just the time to get things into place from a processor standpoint?
There's several challenges. I mean, the first challenge is to explain how genetics works,
Right.
right? I mean, it's second nature to all of us, but it's not second nature to a lot of the industry. So first of all, we have to explain how does genetics work and how do you make genetic progress? And then how does this actually control methane? So how can the genetics of the cow
Mhm.
actually reduce, methane emitted? Of course, you got to answer the questions. Are there any downsides? Is there going to be a reduction in feed efficiencies? Any of those kind of questions. And so far, we've been able to answer those. And what we've seen is the way we've structured the trait to be independent of milk fat and protein is that it tends to be neutral to economics and it tends to be neutral to health. And of course, it's neutral to production. So that makes it a whole lot easier for us to explain that you can select for this and not have a negative impact on the things that everybody cares about, including producers, right? They don't want to give up
No.
production. They don't want to give up health. They want to have just what they got before, but add on a better environmental footprint. So that was some of the challenges. And then, of course, in fact, Drew Sloan, part of our team, has really taken the lion's share of the burden on making those contacts. He's done a lot of travel. He's made a lot of contacts in the rest of the supply chain. We're used to talking to dairy producers, but we're not as used to talking to processors and retailers, and that's been a learning curve for us. But I think we're a lot better at it than we were 2 years ago.
Sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it's a lot different for the processors or anybody to think about as compared to a feed additive or something like it's a totally different concept.
Right, and we always emphasize that you got to have both. You've got to have
Right.
feed additives because they can act quickly. They're more costly, but they act quickly. But you can't have one and not the other. You really need all the tools in the toolbox. But people understand more easily a feed additive. If you say, we're adding something to the feed, let's seaweed, or it's
Hmm.
NO3O and NOP, Bovaer is the brand name. We're going to add this to the feed and it's going to reduce the ability to produce methane. And people get that very easily. Genetics, it takes a lot longer to explain how that works.
I think that's a fantastic overview and a
Yeah.
great update since we haven't spoken to you in 2 years and you guys have been up to a lot in those last 2 years.
No, I think it's just, sticking with it. One of the things we are working on right now is making sure that through the work that we publish, that groups like, Cool Farm Tool is an on-farm calculator. Can they get comfortable with the published research, the calculations that, you know, quantify the reduction and incorporate that into their calculators. And when that happens, then the whole supply chain can say, okay, I guess now we can count it. So once we can count it in our greenhouse gas footprint reports at the end of the year, then they're more likely to really go on board and offer incentives. And that's what's really going to change farmer behavior because
Mhm.
our producers, they are logical decision makers. And if it makes good economic sense for them, they're going to select for it. And until they see some kind of incentive or reward, they're going to just keep doing what they're doing because there's no reason to change.
Mhm.
Some are, choosing to get ahead of the curve, so they're already starting to change the genetic profiles of their herd because it's going to position them better down the road. But for the most part, you're not going to see change until you see incentives.
No, and that makes sense. And we haven't had Jan in 2 years, and we're certainly not going to wait that long again,
No.
because you've got a lot to talk about. And I think that your research is only going to, multiply and come quicker and faster. But I would like to know, what is your ultimate dream with this? When you think
Mhm.
about how this can be implemented, what does Dr. Lohuis think? Are you having a TED talk where that this is going out globally in that format? Or what is your dream for adoption rate?
I don't want to do a TED talk,
Yeah.
but I would say that a dream would be that, you see this reflected in consumer products
Right.
so that either it's through brand recognition where a brand has invested in educating their consumers about the importance of, selecting food that is going to reflect their goals for the environment, and that you will see a change that consumers will decide with their pocketbooks that they're going
Mhm.
to select this brand over that brand because
Mhm.
this brand is going to have a more responsible supply chain. That would be my dream to see those products excel.
Mhm.
For sure. No, that's great.
Well, thank you for joining us again. And like Brenda said, we will definitely not wait this long again to get you back.
My pleasure, and thank you guys. It's nice talking to you.
Thank you. Good to see you, Mike.